Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. Thank you for sticking along with me for my pandemic reading of Boy by Roald Dahl. This is, like I've said before, one of my favorite childhood books. And it's the very first book that I read by Roald Dahl. And then that was it. I fell in love with his writing. And even he has like some adult books that I've read over the years. And I can't say enough. So I hope that you're enjoying. We have just gotten to Oslo, or to Norway, pardon me, and they are making their way to the next chapter, the Magic Island. The next morning, everybody got up early and eager to continue the journey. There was another full day of traveling to be done before we reached our final destination, most of it by boat. So after a rapid breakfast, our cavalcade left the Grand Hotel in 3 more taxis and headed for Oslo docks. There we went on to board a small coastal steamer, and Nanny was heard to say, "I'm sure it leaks. We shall all be food for the fishes before the day is out." Then she would disappear below for the rest of the trip. We loved this part of the journey. The splendid little vessel with its single tall funnel would move out into the calm waters of the fjord and proceed at a leisurely pace along the coast, stopping every hour or so to a small wooden jetty where a group of villagers and summer people would be waiting to welcome friends or to collect parcels and mail. Unless you have sailed down the Oslo fjord like this yourself on a tranquil summer's day, you cannot imagine what it is like. It is impossible to describe the sensation of absolute peace and beauty that surrounds you. The boat weaves in and out between countless tiny islands, some with small, brightly painted wooden houses on them, but many with not a house or a tree on the bare rocks. These granite rocks are so smooth that you can lie and sun yourself on them in your bathing costume without putting a towel underneath. We would see long-legged girls and tall boys basking on the rocks of the islands. There are no sandy beaches on the fjord. The rocks go straight down to the water's edge, and the water is immediately deep. As a result, Norwegian children all learn to swim when they're very young, because if you can't swim, it is difficult to find a place to bathe. Sometimes when our little vessel slipped between 2 small islands, the channel was so narrow we could almost touch the rocks on either side. We would pass rowboats and canoes with flaxen-haired children in them, their skins browned by the sun, and we would wave to them and watch their tiny boats rocking violently in the swell that our larger ship left behind. Late in the afternoon, we would come finally to the end of the journey, the island of Tjom. This was where our mother always took us. Heaven knows how she found it, but to us it was the greatest place on earth. About 200 yards from the jetty, along a narrow, dusty road, stood a simple wooden hotel painted white. It was run by an elderly couple whose faces I still remember vividly, and every year they welcomed us like old friends. Everything about the hotel was extremely primitive, except the dining room. The ceiling, and the floor of our bedrooms were made of plain, unvarnished pine planks. There was a wash basin and a jug of cold water in each of them. The lavatories were in a rickety wooden outhouse at the back of the hotel, and each cubicle contained nothing more than a round hole cut in a piece of wood. Here's a picture of it here. Little outhouse. You sat on the hole, and what you did there dropped into a pit 10 feet below. If you looked down the hole, you would often see rats scurrying about in the gloom. All of this we took for granted. Breakfast was the best meal of the day in our hotel, and it was laid out on a huge table in the middle of the dining room from which you helped yourself. There were maybe 50 different dishes to choose from on that table. There were large jugs of milk, which all Norwegian children drank at every meal. There were plates of cold beef, veal, ham, and pork. There was cold boiled mackerel submerged in aspic. There were spiced and pickled herring fillets, sardines, smoked eels, and cod's roe. There was a large bowl piled high with hot boiled eggs. There were cold omelets with chopped ham in them, and cold chicken and hot coffee for the grown-ups, and hot crisp rolls baked in the hotel kitchen, which we ate with butter and cranberry jam. There were stewed apricots and 5 or 6 different cheeses, including, of course, the ever-present geitost, that tall, brown, rather sweet Norwegian goat cheese, which you find on just about every table on the land. After breakfast, we collected our bathing things, and the whole party, all 10 of us, would pile into our boat. Everyone has some sort of boat in Norway. Nobody sits around in front of the hotel, nor does anyone sit on the beach because there aren't any beaches to sit on. In the early days, we had only a rowboat, but a very fine one it was. It carried all of us easily, with places for 2 rowers. My mother took one pair of oars, and my fairly ancient half-brother took the other, and off we would go. My mother and the half-brother, he was somewhere around 18 then, were expert rowers. They kept in perfect time, and the oars went click, 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 click in their wooden rowlocks, and the rowers never paused once during the long 40-minute journey. The rest of us sat in the boat, trailing our fingers in the clear water and looking for jellyfish. We skimmed across the sound and went whizzing through narrow channels with rocky islands on either side, heading, as always, for a very secret tiny patch of sand on a distant island that only we knew about. In the early days, we needed a place like this where we could paddle and play about because my youngest sister was only 1. The next sister was 3, and I was 4. The rocks in the deep water were no good to us. Every day for several summers, that tiny secret sand patch on that tiny secret island was our regular destination. We would stay there for 3 or 4 hours, messing about in the water and on the rock pools and getting extraordinarily sunburnt. In later years, when we were all a little older and could swim, the daily routine became different. By then, my mother had acquired a motorboat, a small and not very seaworthy white wooden vessel which sat far too low in the water and was powered by an unreliable 1-cylinder engine. The fairly ancient half-brother was the only one who could make the engine go at all. It was extremely difficult to start, and he always had to unscrew the sparking plug and pour petrol into the cylinder. Then he swung a flywheel round and round, and with a bit of luck, after a long coughing and sputtering, the thing would finally get going. When we first acquired the motorboat, my youngest sister was 4 and I was 7. By then, all of us had learned to swim. The exciting new boat made it possible for us to go much farther afield, and every day we would travel far out into the fjord hunting for a different island. There were hundreds of them to choose from. Some were very small, no more than 30 yards long. Others were quite large, maybe half a mile in length. It was wonderful to have such a choice of places, and it was terrific fun to explore each island before we went swimming off the rocks. There were wooden skeletons of shipwrecked boats on those islands, and big white bones were the human bones, and wild raspberries and mussels clinging to the rocks, and some of the islands had shaggy, long-haired goats on them, and even sheep. Now and again, when we were out in the open water beyond the chain of islands, the sea became very rough, and that was when my mother enjoyed herself most. Nobody, not even the tiny children, bothered with life belts in those days. We would cling to the sides of our funny little white motorboat, driving through mountainous white-capped waves and getting drenched to the skin, while my mother calmly handled the tiller. There were times, I promise you, when the waves were so high that we slid down into a trough. The whole world disappeared from sight. Then up and up the little boat would climb, standing almost vertically on its tail until we reached the crest of the next wave, and then it was like being on top of a foaming mountain. It required great skill to handle a small boat in seas like these. The thing can easily capsize or be swamped if the bows do not meet the great combing breakers at just the right angle. But my mother knew exactly how to do it, and we were never afraid. We loved every minute of it, all of us except for our long-suffering nanny, who would bury her face in her hands and call aloud upon the Lord to save her soul. In the early evenings, we nearly always went out fishing. We collected mussels from the rocks for bait, and we got into either the rowboat or the motorboat and pushed off to drop anchor later in some likely spot. The water was very deep and often had to let out 200 feet of line before we touched the bottom. We would sit silent and tense, waiting for a bite, and it always amazed me how even a little nibble at the end of that long line would be transmitted to one's fingers. "A bite!" someone would shout, jerking the line. "I've got him! It's a big one! It's a whopper!" And then came the thrill of hauling in the line, hand over hand, and peering over the side into the clear water to see how big the fish really was as he neared the surface. Cod, whiting, haddock, and mackerel were caught. We caught them all and bore them back triumphantly to the hotel kitchen, where the cheery fat woman who did the cooking promised to get them ready for our supper. I tell you, my friends, those were the days. Next chapter, a visit to the doctor. I have only one unpleasant memory of the summer holidays in Norway. We were in the grandparents' house in Oslo, and my mother said to me, "We're going to the doctor this afternoon. He wants to look at your nose and mouth." I think I was 8 at the time. "What's wrong with my nose and mouth?" I asked. "Nothing much," my mother said, "but I think you've got adenoids." "What are they?" I asked her. "Don't worry about it," she said. "It's nothing." I held my mother's hand as we walked to the doctor's house. It took us about half an hour. There was a kind of dentist chair in the surgery, and I was lifted into it. The doctor had a round mirror strapped to his forehead, and he peered up my nose and into my throat. He then took my mother aside, and they held a whispered conversation. I saw my mother looking rather grim, but she nodded. The doctor now put some boil in the steam coming off the boiling water. I was not in the least apprehensive. I was too young to realize that something out of the ordinary was going to happen. Then a nurse dressed in white came in. She was carrying a red rubber apron and a curved white enamel bowl. She put the apron over the front of my body and tied it around my neck. It was far too big. Then she held the enamel bowl under my chin. The curve of the bowl fit perfectly against the curve of my chest. The doctor was bending over me. In his hand, he held a long, shiny steel instrument. He held it right in front of my face, and to this day, I can still describe it perfectly. It was about the thickness and length of a pencil, and like most pencils, it had lots of sides to it. Toward the end, the metal became much thinner, and at the end of the thin bit of metal, there was a tiny blade set at an angle. The blade wasn't more than a centimeter long, very small, very sharp, very shiny. "Open your mouth," the doctor said, speaking Norwegian. I refused. I thought he was going to do something to my teeth, and everything anyone has ever done to my teeth has been painful. "It won't take 2 seconds," the doctor said. He spoke gently, and I was seduced by his voice, and like a bum, I opened my mouth. The tiny blade flashed in the bright light and disappeared into my mouth. It went high up in the roof of my mouth, and the hand that held the blade gave 4 or 5 quick little twists, and the next moment, out of my mouth into the basin came tumbling a whole mass of flesh and blood. I was too shocked and outraged to do anything but yelp. I was horrified by the huge red lumps that had fallen out of my mouth into the white basin, and my first thought that was the doctor had cut out the whole middle of my head. "Those were your adenoids," I heard the doctor saying. I sat there gasping. The roof of my mouth seemed to be on fire. I grabbed my mother's hand and held onto it tight. I couldn't believe that anyone would do this to me. "Stay where you are," the doctor said. "You'll be all right in a minute." Blood was still coming out of my mouth and dripping into the basin, and the nurse was holding. "Spit it all out," she said. "There's a good boy. You'll be able to breathe much better through your nose after this," the doctor said. The nurse wiped my lips and washed my face with wet flannel. Then she lifted me out of the chair and stood by my feet. I felt a bit groggy. "We'll get you home," my mother said, taking my hand. Down the stairs we went and onto the street. We started walking. I said walking, no trolley cart or taxi. We walked the full half-hour journey back to my grandpa's operation. Someone placed a chair for me beside my grandmother's armchair, and I sat down. My grandmother reached over and covered one of my hands in both of hers. "That won't be the last time you'll go to the doctor in your life," she said, "and with a bit of luck, they won't do too much harm." That was in 1924, and taking out a child's adenoids and often the tonsils as well, without any anesthetic was common practice in those days. I wonder, though, what do you think if some doctor would do that to you today? Okay, let's keep reading for the next 5 minutes. All right, so we're in St. Peter's, 1925 to 29, age 9 to 13, the first day. Here's some pictures that are happening in the book right now. In September 1925, when I was just 9, I set out on the first great adventure of my life, boarding school. My mother had chosen for me a prep school in a part of England which was as near as it could possibly be to our home in South Wales, and it was called St. Peter's. The full postal address was St. Peter's School, Weston-super-Mare, Somerset. Weston-super-Mare is a slightly seaside resort with a vast sandy beach, a tremendous long pier, an esplanade running along the seafront, a clutter of hotels and boarding houses, and about 10,000 little shops selling buckets and spades and sticks of rock and ice creams. It lies almost directly across from the Bristol Channel from Cardiff. And on a clear day, you can stand on the esplanade at Weston and look across the 15 or so miles of water and see the coast of Wales. Beautiful. They were paddle steamers with gigantic swishing paddle wheels on their flanks, and the wheels made the most terrific noise as they sloshed and churned through the water. On the first day of my first term, I set out by taxi in the afternoon with my mother to catch the paddle steamer from Cardiff Docks to Weston-super-Mare. Every piece of clothing I wore was brand new and had my name on it. I wore black shoes, gray woolen stockings with blue turnovers, gray flannel shorts, a gray shirt, a red tie, a gray flannel blazer, and the blue school crest on the breast pocket, and a gray school cap with the same crest just above the peak. Into the taxi that was taking us to the docks went my brand new trunk and my brand new tuck box, and both had R. Dahl painted on them in black. A tuck box is a small pine wood trunk, which is very strongly made, and no boy has ever gone as a boarder to any English prep school without one. It is his own secret storehouse, as secret as a lady's handbag, and there is an unwritten law that no other boy, no teacher, not even the headmaster himself, has the right to pry into the contents of your tuck box. The owner has the key in his pocket, and that is where it stays. At St. Peter's, the tuck boxes were ranged shoulder to shoulder all around the four walls of the changing room, and your own tuck box stood directly below the peg on which you hung your game's clothes. A tuck box, as the name implies, is a box in which you store your tuck. A prep school in those days, a parcel of tuck was sent once a week by anxious mothers to their ravenous little sons, and an average tuck box would probably contain, at almost any time, half a homemade currant cake, a packet of squashed fly biscuits, a couple of oranges, an apple, a banana, a pot of strawberry jam or marmite, a bar of chocolate, a bag of licorice all sorts, and a tin of Bassett's lemonade powder. An English school in those days was purely a money-making business, owned and operated by the headmaster. It suited him, therefore, to give the boys as little food as possible himself, and to encourage parents in various cunning ways to feed their offspring by parcel post from home. By all means, my dear Mrs. Dahl, do send your boy some little treats now and again, he would say, perhaps a few oranges and apples once a week. Fruit was very expensive, and a nice currant cake, a large currant cake perhaps, because small boys have large appetites. Do they not? Ha ha ha, yes, as often as you like. More than once a week if you wish. Of course, I'll be getting plenty of good food here, the best there is, but it never tastes quite the same as home cooking, does it? I'm sure you wouldn't want him to be the only one who doesn't get a good, lovely parcel from home once a week. As well as tuck, a tuck box would also contain all manner of treasures such as a magnet, a pocket knife, a compass, a ball of string, a clockwork racing car, half a dozen lead soldiers, a box of conjuring tricks, some tiddlywinks, a Mexican jumping bean, a catapult, some foreign stamps, a couple of stink bombs, and I remember one boy called Arkle who drilled an air hole in the lid of his tuck box and kept a frog in there on which he fed on slugs. So off we went, my mother and I, and my trunk and my tuck box, and we boarded the paddle steamer and swishing across the Bristol Channel in a shower of spray. I liked that part of it, but I began to grow apprehensive as I disembarked on the pier at Weston-super-Mare and watched my trunk and tuck box being loaded into an English taxi which would drive us to St. Peter's. I had absolutely no idea what was in store for me. I'd never spent a single night away from our large family before. St. Peter's was on a hill above the town. It was a long 3-storied stone building that looked rather like a private lunatic asylum, and in front of it lay the playing fields with their 3 football pitches. 1/3 of the building was reserved for the headmaster and his family. The rest of it housed the boys, about 150 of them altogether, if I remember rightly. As we got out of the taxi, I saw the whole driveway abustle with small boys and their parents and their trunks and their tuck boxes, and a man I took to be the headmaster was swimming around along them, shaking everybody by the hand. I've already told you that all the headmasters are giants, and this one was no exception. He advanced upon my mother and shook her by the hand, and he shook me by the hand, and as he did so, he gave me the kind of flashing grin a shark might give to a small fish just before he gobbles it up. One of his front teeth, I noticed, was edged all the way around with gold, and his hair was slicked down so much with hair cream that it glistened like butter. Right, he said to me, off you go and report to the matron. And to my mother, he said briskly, goodbye, Mrs. Dahl. I shouldn't linger if I were you. We'll look after him. My mother got the message. She kissed me on the cheek and said goodbye and climbed right back into the taxi. The headmaster moved away to another group and I was left standing there beside him. So I look forward to you hearing about his adventures in boarding school. I want you to think about if you had a little tuck box, what would you be putting in it? What kind of food would you like in it that we have now instead of what they had in the 20s? So I want you to think about that. And then I want you to think about, did you figure out what a headmaster is yet? And I want you to think about, has there been a time in your life where you've had to be away from your family and maybe you felt really nervous, or maybe going to a new school, or you're moving houses or something like that? Can you tell me or tell your teachers an experience in your life where you felt the same feeling that maybe Roald Dahl was feeling there? I hope you have a really great weekend. I'll take a pause for the weekend and we will come up with part 5 on Monday. I hope you have a really, really great weekend. Stay safe. Take care of yourselves. Bye, everyone.